The wagon train limped into Salina, Kansas on a blistering July afternoon in 1868, and Abigail Turner knew she was being sold like livestock before anyone said a word. She watched through the canvas opening as the men gathered around, their eyes assessing the women who had survived the journey from St. Louis, calculating which ones would make suitable wives for homesteaders desperate for companionship in this unforgiving land. Her twisted ankle throbbed where it rested on a folded blanket, swollen to twice its normal size after she had fallen from the wagon 3 days prior, when a wheel hit a rut so deep it nearly overturned the entire rig. The bone wasn't broken, thank the Lord, but the ligaments had torn badly enough that even the slightest pressure sent lightning bolts of agony shooting up her leg. "Lonnie!" "Line them up," barked Cornelius Hatch, the wagon master who had promised these women respectable positions as teachers or seamstresses out west, only to reveal halfway through the journey that he had already collected fees from lonely men looking for brides. The betrayal still burned in Abigail's chest, hot as the Kansas sun beating down on the dusty main street. She had paid her last $20 to escape her stepfather's house in St. Louis, believing she was heading toward freedom and employment, not toward another form of captivity. The other women climbed down from the wagons with varying degrees of resignation or hope on their faces. Abigail remained where she was, knowing she couldn't walk without support, knowing that her injury made her worthless in this brutal marketplace. Who would want a wife who couldn't even stand on her own 2 feet? Who would choose a woman who couldn't work a garden or chase after chickens or dance at a community gathering? She pressed her back against the wooden slats and tried to make herself invisible, but Hatch noticed her absence immediately. "You too, Turner," he called, his voice cutting through the murmur of conversation. "Don't think you can hide back there." "I cannot walk," she replied, her voice steady despite the fear coiling in her stomach. "My ankle is too damaged." "Then crawl if you have to. I'm not feeding you another day on my dime." His face appeared at the back of the wagon, red and glistening with sweat, his expression harder than the iron rims on the wheels. "You'll stand with the others, or I'll dump you in the street right here and now. Your choice." Abigail bit down on her lower lip hard enough to taste copper. She would not cry in front of this man. She would not give him that satisfaction. Instead, she gripped the edge of the wagon and began to pull herself toward the opening, her injured leg dragging uselessly behind her. The pain was extraordinary, like being stabbed with hot pokers, but she refused to make a sound. She had learned long ago that showing weakness only invited cruelty. 2 of the other women, Mary and Catherine, rushed forward to help her, but Hatch waved them away. "Let her manage herself. The men need to see what they're getting." He laughed at his own joke, and Abigail felt her face burn with humiliation. She made it to the edge of the wagon and sat there, her injured leg dangling, her hands trembling with effort and pain. The street was a good 4 feet below her, and she had no idea how she was going to get down without collapsing. The gathered men stood in a loose semicircle, maybe 15 or 20 of them, ranging from young cowboys barely old enough to shave to grizzled homesteaders with weather-beaten faces and desperate eyes. They watched her struggle with expressions that varied from pity to disgust to simple indifference. None of them moved to help. Why would they? She was damaged goods, a poor investment, a burden no sensible man would willingly take on. That was when she saw him. He stood apart from the others, leaning against the post of the general store with his arms crossed over a chest so broad it seemed to block out the sun. He was a mountain of a man, easily 6.5 feet tall, with shoulders that strained against his buckskin shirt and arms thick with muscle earned through hard labor in unforgiving terrain. His hair, dark as coal and slightly wavy, hung past his shoulders, held back from his face by a strip of leather tied around his forehead. A full beard covered his jaw, neatly trimmed but wild enough to mark him as someone who spent more time in the wilderness than in town. His eyes, even from this distance, were startling in their intensity, a pale gray that seemed to see straight through pretense and politeness to the truth beneath. He wasn't looking at the other women. He was looking directly at her. Abigail felt her breath catch in her throat. There was something in his gaze that wasn't pity or contempt. It was assessment, certainly, but of a different kind. He was watching how she handled herself, how she bore the pain, how she refused to beg or plead or collapse into helpless tears. He pushed away from the post with the fluid grace of a predator and walked toward the wagon, each step deliberate and purposeful. The other men parted to let him through, some nodding respectfully, others eyeing him with barely concealed wariness. "I'll take the limping one," he said, his voice a deep rumble that seemed to resonate in Abigail's chest. It wasn't a question or a request. It was a statement of fact. Hatch's eyebrows shot up. "This one? Zane, you can have your pick of any of these women. That one can't even walk. She'll be nothing but trouble." The mountain man, Zane, didn't take his eyes off Abigail. "I said I'll take her. How much?" "Same as the others. $50. But I'm telling you she's damaged. I should probably charge you less, seeing as how you'll have to carry her everywhere for weeks, maybe months." $50, Zane repeated, pulling a leather pouch from his belt. He counted out the coins with quick efficiency and dropped them into Hatch's outstretched palm. Then, without another word, he stepped up onto the wagon wheel and climbed into the bed beside Abigail. Up close, he was even more imposing, all muscle and controlled strength, but his hands when he reached for her were surprisingly gentle. "I'm going to lift you down," he said quietly, meeting her eyes for the first time from close range. His gaze was softer than she had expected, almost kind, though there was steel beneath it. "It's going to hurt. I'm sorry for that." Abigail opened her mouth to respond, but before she could form words, he slid one arm beneath her knees and the other behind her back and lifted her as though she weighed nothing at all. The sudden movement jarred her ankle, and despite her determination not to cry out, a sharp gasp escaped her lips. He held her against his chest, so high off the ground that she instinctively wrapped her arms around his neck, her fingers brushing against the rough texture of his hair. "Easy," he murmured, his breath warm against her temple. "I've got you." He jumped down from the wagon, with her cradled in his arms, landing with a slight flex of his knees to absorb the impact. Abigail clung to him, her heart hammering against her ribs, completely overwhelmed by the sudden turn of events. 10 minutes ago, she had been certain she would be abandoned in this street, left to beg or starve or worse. Now she was being carried through town by a stranger who looked like he could wrestle bears for entertainment, heading toward a future she couldn't begin to imagine. The other men watched them pass with knowing looks and a few quiet comments that Abigail couldn't quite hear. Zane ignored them all, his stride long and unhurried as he carried her down the main street toward the edge of town where a massive chestnut horse stood tied to a hitching post. The animal was as impressive as its owner, standing at least 17 hands high with a chest like a barrel and legs built for carrying heavy loads over rough terrain. "This is going to be awkward," Zane said, the first hint of uncertainty in his voice. "But I need both hands to ride. I'm going to have to hold you in front of me. If it gets too painful, you tell me, and we'll stop. Understood?" "Where are we going?" Abigail finally found her voice, though it came out smaller than she would have liked. "My cabin. It's about an hour's ride north of here, up in the hills." He positioned her carefully on the saddle, then swung up behind her with the ease of someone who had spent half his life on horseback. His arms came around her to grip the reins, essentially caging her against his chest. She could feel the heat of his body through the thin fabric of her dress, smell the scent of leather and pine and something else she couldn't quite identify, something wild and clean. "I don't even know your full name," she said as the horse began to move, its gait smooth enough that her ankle only protested mildly. "Caden Zane," he replied. "Most people just call me Zane, and you're Abigail Turner, according to the wagon master's records." "How did you know to look at those?" "I didn't. I heard him yell your name when he was trying to force you out of the wagon." There was a hard edge to his voice now, a barely suppressed anger that made Abigail wonder what he might have done if Hatch had pushed any harder. "That man is lucky I believe in following the law, or I would have done more than just pay him his blood money." They rode in silence for a while, leaving the small collection of buildings that made up Salina behind and heading into open prairie land that gradually gave way to rolling hills covered in tall grass and wildflowers. The sun was beginning its descent toward the western horizon, painting the sky in shades of gold and amber. Despite the pain in her ankle, despite the strangeness of her situation, Abigail felt something in her chest loosen just slightly. The air here was cleaner than in the city, carrying the scent of growing things instead of coal smoke and human waste. The landscape stretched out endlessly in all directions, offering a sense of possibility that she hadn't felt in years. "Why did you choose me?" she asked finally, the question that had been burning in her mind since he first spoke up. "You could have had any of those women. Some of them were pretty and none of them were injured. Why would you saddle yourself with someone who can't even walk?" Caden was quiet for so long that Abigail thought he might not answer. When he did speak, his voice was thoughtful, measured. "I've lived in these hills for 8 years. I came out here after the war, looking for peace and quiet, and I found it. Built my cabin with my own hands, learned to trap and hunt, to live off the land. I've been content enough with my own company, but lately I've been thinking it might be time to build something more than just a solitary life. When I heard there was a wagon train coming through with women looking to settle, I figured I'd come see if any of them might be willing to take a chance on a mountain man." He shifted slightly in the saddle, adjusting his grip on the reins. "I watched those other women getting off the wagon. They were scared, most of them, or angry, or resigned. But when I saw you trying to get down, even though you were clearly in agony, refusing to ask for help, refusing to show weakness even when that bastard was mocking you, I saw something different. I saw strength. I saw pride. I saw someone who wouldn't quit even when the world was doing its best to break her. That's the kind of woman I want beside me. Someone who can endure hard times, because life up in those hills isn't easy. Someone who won't crumble at the first sign of trouble." Abigail felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes, but they were different from the tears she had been holding back in the wagon. These were born of something closer to gratitude, or maybe relief. "I'm not sure I'm as strong as you think I am." "I think you'll surprise yourself," Caden said quietly. "But I want you to know something up front. I paid money for you today, but I don't own you. You're not my property or my slave. When we get to the cabin, you'll have your own room until you're healed and until you decide what you want to do. If you want to stay, we'll figure out how to make it work. If you want to leave, I'll take you back to town or anywhere else you want to go, and I won't hold it against you. You have my word on that." The tears spilled over then, tracking down her dusty cheeks. "Thank you," she whispered, not trusting her voice for anything more. They climbed higher into the hills as the sun sank lower, following a narrow trail that wound between stands of cottonwood and oak. The temperature dropped slightly as they gained elevation, and Abigail found herself unconsciously leaning back against Caden's solid warmth. He didn't comment on it, just adjusted his arms slightly to better support her weight. The horse plodded onward with the patience of an animal that had made this journey countless times before, its ears swiveling to catch every sound from the surrounding landscape. Finally, as the first stars began to appear in the deepening blue of the sky, they crested a rise, and Abigail saw the cabin. It sat in a small clearing surrounded by tall pines, built from logs that had been carefully notched and fitted together. Smoke rose from a stone chimney, suggesting that someone had been tending the fire recently. A covered porch ran along the front of the structure, and she could see a sturdy rocking chair and a bench placed to take advantage of the view down the valley. Behind the cabin, she glimpsed a smaller building that was probably a smokehouse or storage shed, and a corral that held 2 more horses. "It's beautiful," Abigail said softly, and meant it. There was something deeply appealing about this place, something peaceful and solid that spoke of a man who took pride in his work and his home. "It's simple, but it keeps the weather out," Caden said, though she could hear the pleasure in his voice at her compliment. He dismounted first, then reached up to lift her down with the same careful gentleness he had shown before. This time, instead of setting her on her feet, he carried her straight toward the cabin, climbing the 3 steps to the porch without any visible strain. The door was already unlatched. He pushed it open with his shoulder and carried her across the threshold into a single large room that served as kitchen, dining area, and living space all in one. A fire burned in the stone hearth, casting dancing shadows across log walls hung with furs and tools and various implements of frontier life. A sturdy table with 2 chairs occupied the center of the space, and she could see an iron stove in one corner near shelves stocked with supplies. 2 doors on the far wall presumably led to bedrooms. Caden carried her to a leather chair near the fire and set her down with infinite care, making sure her injured leg was supported on a small ottoman. "I'm going to take care of the horse and bring in some supplies," he said, already moving toward the door. "There's water in the pitcher on the table if you're thirsty. I'll be back in a few minutes, and then we'll take a look at that ankle." He was gone before Abigail could respond, the door closing softly behind him. She sat in the chair, looking around at what was apparently going to be her new home, at least temporarily, and tried to process everything that had happened in the past few hours. This morning she had been a prisoner in a wagon, facing an uncertain and frightening future. Now she was sitting in a comfortable chair in front of a warm fire, having been claimed by a mountain man who spoke to her with kindness and respect, who promised her choices instead of obligations. It felt like a dream, the kind that you wake up from with disappointment flooding through your veins. But when Caden returned carrying her small bag of belongings that he must have retrieved from the wagon, along with several bundles wrapped in oilcloth, she knew it was real. He set everything down and then disappeared through one of the doors, emerging a moment later with a basin of water, clean cloths, and a jar of something that looked like salve. "Let me see your ankle," he said, kneeling beside her chair with a grace surprising in such a large man. "I need to assess how bad it really is." Abigail felt her face flush. It was one thing to let him carry her when there was no other choice. It was quite another to have him handling her leg in the intimate space of his home. But she could see no way around it, and truthfully, her ankle was throbbing so badly that she needed help. She nodded and watched as he carefully lifted her skirt just enough to expose her injured leg, his movements professional and impersonal. The ankle was a mess. The swelling had turned the skin a mottled purple and green, stretched tight and shiny over what should have been delicate bones. Caden sucked in a breath through his teeth but didn't flinch away. Instead, he began to gently probe the area with his fingers, his touch feather light as he tested each movement. "It's not broken," he confirmed after a thorough examination. "But you've torn the ligaments badly. It's going to take time to heal, probably 6 to 8 weeks before you can put full weight on it. In the meantime, you need to stay off it as much as possible, keep it elevated, and use cold compresses to bring down the swelling." He reached for the basin and wrung out one of the cloths, then wrapped it around her ankle with careful precision. The cold water felt like heaven against the burning heat of the injury. "I'm sorry," Abigail said, though she wasn't entirely sure what she was apologizing for being damaged, for being a burden, for not being the capable partner he had hoped for. Caden looked up at her, those gray eyes steady and calm. "You have nothing to be sorry for. Injuries happen. They heal. We'll manage until you're back on your feet." He finished wrapping her ankle and then sat back on his heels. "Now, I imagine you're hungry. I'm not much of a cook, but I can manage basic meals. How does venison stew sound?" "Like the most wonderful thing I've ever heard," Abigail admitted, suddenly aware that she hadn't eaten since dawn and her stomach was making its displeasure known. Caden smiled, the expression transforming his rugged features into something unexpectedly warm. "Good. You rest here, and I'll get something together." He rose to his feet and moved to the kitchen area, pulling down an iron pot and beginning to assemble ingredients with the efficiency of someone who had cooked for himself for years. Abigail watched him work, mesmerized by the contrast between his massive size and the delicate care he took with each task. He moved through the space like a man completely comfortable in his own domain, confident and competent. While the stew heated, he disappeared into one of the bedrooms again and came back with blankets and pillows. "I'm going to make up a bed for you in here tonight," he explained, gesturing to a long bench near the wall that she hadn't noticed before. "I don't want you trying to navigate to the bedroom until we can rig up some kind of crutch for you. This way, you'll be close to the fire and close to help if you need it." "Where will you sleep?" Abigail asked. "My room is through that door. I'm a light sleeper, so if you need anything during the night, just call out." He arranged the bedding on the bench, transforming it into a reasonably comfortable-looking sleeping space. "Tomorrow I'll start working on making things more accessible for you. There's a lot we can do to help you get around without putting weight on that ankle." The stew was ready shortly after, rich with meat and vegetables and herbs that filled the cabin with a mouth-watering aroma. Caden ladled generous portions into wooden bowls and brought one to Abigail, along with a thick slice of bread. She accepted it gratefully, balancing the bowl on her lap and taking her first bite. The flavors exploded across her tongue, hearty and satisfying in a way that the thin gruel they had been served on the wagon train had never been. "This is delicious," she said, and watched pleasure flicker across his face. "My mother taught me," he said, settling into the chair across from her with his own bowl. She always said a man who couldn't feed himself was dependent, and dependent men make poor decisions. He took a bite, chewing thoughtfully. She died when I was 15, fever. My father followed her 6 months later. Couldn't live without her, I think, though the doctor said it was his heart. I'm sorry, Abigail said softly. That must have been terribly hard. It was a long time ago. Caden's voice was neutral, but she could hear the old grief beneath it. What about you? What brought you to that wagon train? You don't strike me as the type to sign up for something like that without desperate reasons. Abigail hesitated, the bread turning to ash in her mouth as she thought about her stepfather's house, about the way he looked at her after her mother died, about the night she realized she needed to leave before something terrible happened. I needed to escape, she said finally, choosing her words carefully. My mother passed 2 years ago, and the man she married was not someone I could continue to live with. I saw an advertisement for teaching positions in Kansas and thought it was my chance for a new start. I didn't realize until we were already weeks into the journey that it was all a lie, that we were being brought out here to be sold as brides. Caden's jaw tightened, the muscles working beneath his beard. That man, Hatch, he should be arrested. What he did was fraud at minimum, possibly kidnapping, depending on how you look at it. None of us have the money or the power to take him to court, Abigail said wearily. And truthfully, I'm not sure any judge would care. We're just women. We're not worth much in the eyes of the law. You're worth something to me. The words were quiet, but fierce, and Abigail found herself looking up to meet Caden's eyes. The intensity there took her breath away. I want you to understand that. You're not just some burden I've taken on or some obligation I have to fulfill. I saw something in you today that I haven't seen in a long time. I saw fire. I saw determination. I saw someone worth knowing. Abigail felt her throat tighten with emotion. You don't even know me. Not yet, Caden agreed, but I'd like to, if you're willing. They finished their meal in comfortable silence, and then Caden cleared away the dishes while Abigail tried not to fall asleep in the chair. The exhaustion of the day was catching up with her, the pain in her ankle a dull throb that never quite faded, and the warmth of the fire was making her eyelids heavy. She must have dozed off because the next thing she knew, Caden was gently shaking her shoulder. Come on, he said softly, let's get you to bed before you fall out of that chair. He lifted her again, and this time Abigail was too tired to feel self-conscious about it. She let her head rest against his shoulder as he carried her to the makeshift bed he had prepared, let him settle her among the blankets with her ankle carefully propped on a pillow. He pulled a quilt over her, tucking it around her shoulders with a tenderness that made her want to cry. Sleep well, Abigail, he murmured, brushing a strand of hair back from her face. You're safe here. And for the first time in longer than she could remember, Abigail believed that might actually be true. She woke to the smell of coffee and bacon and the sound of someone moving around the cabin with quiet efficiency. Morning light streamed through the windows, golden and warm, painting everything in shades of honey and amber. Abigail lay still for a moment, orienting herself to this new reality, before carefully pushing herself up to a sitting position. Her ankle was still swollen and painful, but the throbbing had subsided to a more manageable level, and the rest had done her good. Caden appeared from the kitchen area, carrying a mug of coffee and a plate of food. Morning, he said, his voice rough with the remnants of sleep. His hair was loose around his shoulders, and he hadn't yet put on his shirt, leaving his massive chest and arms bare. Abigail tried very hard not to stare at the play of muscles beneath sun-bronzed skin, at the various scars that marked his body with the history of a hard life lived outdoors. How's the ankle? Better, she managed, accepting the coffee gratefully. The first sip was heaven, strong and hot and slightly bitter. Thank you for this. For all of this. You don't need to keep thanking me, Caden said, settling into a chair near her bed. This is just how things should be, people taking care of each other. He gestured to the plate he had brought. Eat up. I'm going to head out after breakfast to check my trap lines, but I should be back by midday. I've left everything you might need within reach here. There's a chamber pot behind that screen if you need it, and I've set up a basin with fresh water for washing. If something happens, if you need help for any reason, I've left my rifle near the door, and there's a bell on the table you can ring that'll carry down the valley. My nearest neighbor will hear it and come running. You have neighbors up here? Abigail asked, surprised. The cabin felt so isolated that she had assumed they were completely alone in these hills. About a mile east, there's another family, the Andersons. Good people. Thomas and Rebecca and their 3 boys. They've been here about as long as I have. We help each other out when needed." He stood and moved back toward his bedroom, returning a moment later with a shirt that he pulled over his head. "I'll introduce you properly once you're more settled and healed up. Rebecca will be pleased to have another woman nearby. She's been wanting female company for years." The idea of neighbors, of potential friends, made something warm bloom in Abigail's chest. She had been so focused on her immediate circumstances that she hadn't thought about what a future here might actually look like, what kind of life she might build. "I'd like that," she said softly. Caden finished preparing for his departure, strapping on a knife belt and gathering various supplies into a leather satchel. Before he left, he knelt beside her bed one more time and carefully examined her ankle, rewrapping it with fresh cloths soaked in cold water. His hands were gentle but sure, and Abigail found herself watching his face instead of his work, studying the strong line of his jaw, the small scar that bisected his left eyebrow, the way his eyes crinkled slightly at the corners when he concentrated. "I'll be back soon," he promised, rising to his full height. "Take it easy today. Rest, heal. We've got plenty of time to figure everything else out." And then he was gone, the door closing behind him with a soft click, leaving Abigail alone in the cabin. She ate her breakfast slowly, savoring each bite, and then carefully maneuvered herself to the washing basin to clean up as best she could. It was awkward and frustrating, trying to move with only one functional leg, but she managed it. She had always been resourceful when she needed to be. The day passed slowly. Abigail dozed on and off, her body demanding rest to heal from both the injury and the exhaustion of the journey. When she was awake, she studied the cabin, noting the details that spoke of Caden's character. The furniture was handmade but well-crafted, every joint tight and smooth. The furs on the walls were cleanly tanned, free of the smell that often accompanied poorly prepared hides. Books lined a small shelf near the fireplace, their spines worn from frequent reading. Whoever Caden Zane was, he was not the rough, uneducated mountain man she might have expected. He was someone who valued beauty and knowledge as well as survival. He returned just after noon, as promised, carrying a string of rabbits and looking windswept and alive in a way that made Abigail's breath catch. There was something magnetic about him, something that drew the eye and held it. He cleaned his catch outside and then came in to check on her, his face creasing with concern when he saw her trying to reach a book from the shelf. "Here, let me," he said, crossing the room in 3 long strides and pulling down the volume she had been stretching toward. "Which one did you want?" "That one is fine," Abigail said, accepting the book. It was a collection of poetry by William Wordsworth, the pages soft with handling. "You like poetry?" "I like words," Caden said simply. "Out here, books are the only way to remember that there's a world beyond these hills, that there are ideas and beauty and thoughts bigger than just surviving the next winter." He smiled slightly. "My mother loved poetry. She used to read to me every night before bed. After she died, I kept her books. They're some of the only things I have left of her." "She sounds like she was a remarkable woman." She was. Caden moved to the kitchen area and began preparing lunch, his hands busy with familiar tasks. "She came west with my father when she was just 17, left everything she knew in Pennsylvania to build a life in Missouri. It wasn't easy, but she never complained. She taught me that strength isn't about never feeling fear or pain. It's about facing those things and moving forward anyway." Abigail thought about that as she opened the book, her fingers tracing the faded ink on the pages. "I think she and I would have gotten along." Over the next few weeks, a routine developed. Caden would wake before dawn and see to his chores, checking his trap lines, hunting for meat, tending to the horses, and maintaining the property. He would return by midday to make lunch and check on Abigail, spending an hour or 2 in the cabin before heading back out to complete whatever other tasks needed doing. In the evenings, they would eat dinner together and then sit by the fire, talking or reading or simply enjoying each other's company in comfortable silence. Caden proved to be endlessly inventive when it came to helping Abigail manage her limitations. He fashioned a crutch from a forked branch, padding it with soft leather so it wouldn't chafe under her arm. He built a small bench on wheels that she could sit on and push herself around the cabin floor, giving her mobility without putting weight on her ankle. He even constructed a ramp over the front steps so she could wheel herself out onto the porch to enjoy the fresh air and the view down the valley. As her ankle slowly healed, Abigail found herself falling into a life that felt more real than anything she had experienced before. There was a simplicity to the days here, a rhythm dictated by the sun and the seasons rather than by clocks and social obligations. She began to help with small tasks, peeling vegetables for dinner while seated at the table, mending Caden's shirts when she noticed they were wearing thin at the elbows, organizing his kitchen supplies in a way that made more sense than his bachelor's chaos. And slowly, carefully, they learned each other. Abigail discovered that Caden had fought in the Civil War, enlisting at 19 and serving as a sharpshooter in the Union Army. He didn't talk much about those years, but she could see the shadows that crossed his face when something triggered a memory. She learned that he was patient almost to a fault, that he had a dry sense of humor that caught her off guard and made her laugh, that he was scrupulously honest and expected the same from others. She learned that he was kind, not just to her but to every creature that crossed his path, that he trapped only what he needed and hunted with respect for the animals that gave their lives to feed him. Caden learned that Abigail had been educated by her mother, who had been a schoolteacher before marriage. She could read Latin and knew enough Greek to puzzle through basic texts. She had a quick mind and a quicker tongue when something stirred her passion. She loved music, but had never had the chance to learn an instrument. She was afraid of thunderstorms because her father had been killed by lightning when she was 7. She was brave in ways that had nothing to do with physical courage and everything to do with the strength it took to keep hoping when hope seemed foolish. One evening, about 5 weeks after Abigail had arrived at the cabin, they were sitting on the porch watching the sunset over the valley. She had graduated from the wheeled bench to the crutch, able to move around the cabin and even venture outside with Caden's assistance. Her ankle was still weak and prone to swelling if she overdid it, but the worst of the injury had healed. She could feel herself growing stronger every day. "I've been thinking," Caden said quietly, his voice barely audible over the evening chorus of insects and birds. "About what comes next." Abigail's heart stuttered in her chest. This was it then, the moment when he told her she was healed enough to leave, that it was time for her to decide whether she wanted to stay or go. She had been dreading this conversation even as she knew it was inevitable. "What have you been thinking?" "I've been thinking that I don't want you to leave." He turned to look at her, those gray eyes serious and searching. "These past weeks, having you here, it's been the best time I can remember since before the war. The cabin feels like a home instead of just a place to sleep. I find myself looking forward to coming back each day, excited to tell you about something I saw or to hear what you've been thinking about. I wake up happy. I haven't been able to say that in a very long time." "Caden," Abigail breathed, afraid to believe what she was hearing. "Let me finish," he said gently. "I know we started this arrangement under strange circumstances. I know I basically bought you, even though I've tried to make it clear that you're not property. But somewhere along the way, it stopped being about obligation or charity or anything like that. It became about wanting. I want you here, Abigail. Not as a housekeeper or a burden or anything like that. I want you here as my partner, my wife, if you'll have me." Abigail felt tears spring to her eyes, her throat tight with emotion. "You want to marry me?" "I want to marry you," Caden confirmed. "I want to build a life with you, a real life. I want to wake up beside you every morning and fall asleep knowing you're safe and warm and cared for. I want to work this land with you, make a home that belongs to both of us. I want to know all your thoughts and dreams and fears, and I want you to know mine. I want everything. Abigail, if you're willing to take a chance on a mountain man who lives in the middle of nowhere and probably doesn't have enough social graces to survive in polite company." A laugh bubbled up through the tears, and Abigail found herself reaching for his hand, lacing her fingers through his much larger ones. "I've been falling in love with you," she confessed, the words spilling out in a rush now that the dam had broken. "These past weeks, watching you, learning you, I've been trying so hard not to hope for this because I didn't think you could possibly want me the way I want you. You're everything I never knew I needed. You're strong and kind and patient and honest. You make me feel safe in a way I've never felt before. You make me feel valued, not for what I can do or what I look like, but for who I am. So yes, Caden Zane. Yes, I'll marry you. Yes, I'll build a life with you. Yes, to all of it. Caden's face split into a grin so wide and genuine that it transformed him from handsome to absolutely devastating. He lifted her hand to his lips and kissed her knuckles, his beard rough against her skin in a way that sent shivers down her spine. I'm going to make you happy, he promised, his voice fierce with determination. I'm going to spend every day of the rest of my life making sure you never regret this decision. I already know I won't, Abigail said softly, and then gasped in surprise as Caden surged forward and kissed her properly, his lips claiming hers with a passion that had been carefully restrained until now. The kiss was everything she had imagined and more, tender and demanding all at once, tasting of coffee and promise and the beginning of forever. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Caden rested his forehead against hers and laughed quietly. I've been wanting to do that for weeks. Why didn't you? Abigail asked, her fingers tracing the strong line of his jaw. Because I wanted you to have time to decide what you wanted without feeling pressured. Because I wanted you to be sure. He kissed her again, softer this time, a gentle press of lips that spoke of reverence and care. I didn't want you to think I expected anything just because I brought you here. You're a good man, Caden Zane, Abigail murmured against his mouth. The best man I've ever known. They were married 3 weeks later in a small ceremony at the church in Salina, with Thomas and Rebecca Anderson serving as witnesses, and their 3 boys running circles around the pews in barely contained excitement. Abigail wore a simple dress of blue calico that Rebecca had helped her sew, and Caden wore his best shirt with his hair neatly tied back and his beard freshly trimmed. The preacher was an elderly man who had seen countless frontier marriages, but even he seemed moved by the obvious love between the couple standing before him. I now pronounce you husband and wife, he said with a smile. You may kiss your bride. Caden didn't need to be told twice. He pulled Abigail into his arms and kissed her thoroughly, not caring that they were in a church or that they had an audience. When he finally released her, her face was flushed and her eyes were shining, and he knew he had made the best decision of his life when he chose the limping woman from that wagon train. The Andersons hosted a small celebration at their homestead that afternoon, with Rebecca producing a cake that she had been secretly preparing for days, and Thomas breaking out a bottle of whiskey he had been saving for a special occasion. The boys presented Abigail with a bouquet of wildflowers they had picked that morning, their faces solemn with the importance of their task. It was perfect in its simplicity, a gathering of friends who genuinely cared, celebrating a union born from unexpected circumstances, but rooted in real affection and respect. As the sun began to set, Caden and Abigail said their goodbyes and rode back toward their cabin, toward the home they would now share officially as husband and wife. Abigail sat in front of Caden on the big chestnut horse, his arms around her, her head resting back against his shoulder. Her ankle was nearly healed now, strong enough to bear her weight, though she still favored it slightly when she was tired. Everything had changed so quickly, and yet it all felt perfectly right. When they reached the cabin, Caden dismounted and then lifted Abigail down, but instead of setting her on her feet, he held her cradled against his chest. "What are you doing?" she asked, laughing. "Carrying my bride across the threshold," he said simply. "I did it once before, but that time you were a stranger in pain. This time you're my wife, and I want to do it properly." He climbed the steps to the porch and pushed open the door with his shoulder, carrying Abigail into the cabin that was now truly their home. The fire was banked low in the hearth, casting a warm glow across the familiar space. But everything looked different now, charged with new meaning and new promise. This wasn't just Caden's cabin anymore. It was theirs, a place where they would build their life together. Caden carried her not to the bench where she had slept for those first weeks, but through the door to his bedroom, to the large bed with its heavy quilts and soft pillows. He set her down gently, his eyes dark with desire, but also with tenderness. "Are you sure about this?" he asked quietly. "About me? About this life? Because once we take this step, I'm not letting you go. You're mine, Abigail Zane, and I'm yours, and that's how it stays." "I'm sure," Abigail said, reaching up to cup his bearded face in her hands. "I've never been more sure of anything in my life. I love you, Caden. I love your strength and your gentleness. I love the way you see the world, the way you've made me feel valued and wanted. I love this cabin and this life and the future we're going to build. So yes, I'm absolutely sure." Caden kissed her then, slow and deep, his hands moving to the buttons of her dress with careful deliberation. They undressed each other by the light of a single candle, exploring with gentle touches and whispered words, learning each other's bodies the way they had been learning each other's minds and hearts over the past weeks. When Caden finally made Abigail his wife in every sense of the word, it was with a reverence that brought tears to her eyes, a claiming that felt like coming home. Afterward, they lay tangled together in the big bed, Abigail's head pillowed on Caden's massive chest, his arms wrapped securely around her. She traced idle patterns on his skin, following the lines of old scars, feeling utterly safe and cherished. "What are you thinking?" Caden murmured, his hand stroking through her hair. "I'm thinking about how my life has changed," Abigail said softly. 2 months ago, I was trapped in a situation I couldn't escape, heading toward a future I didn't want. I was injured and afraid, and certain that I was going to end up abandoned or worse. And then you chose me. Out of all those women, you chose the broken one. You saw something in me that I didn't even see in myself. You gave me a home and a future, and love. You gave me everything." "You gave me just as much," Caden said, tilting her chin up so he could see her face. "Maybe more. You brought light into a life that had been dark for a long time. You reminded me that there are things worth fighting for beyond just survival. You made me want to be better, do better, build something that matters. So thank you, Abigail, for taking a chance on a mountain man, for seeing past the rough exterior to whatever you found worth loving." "I love all of you," Abigail said firmly. "The rough exterior and everything beneath it, every single part." They fell asleep wrapped in each other's arms, warm and safe and deeply content. The first year of their marriage passed in a blur of hard work and deep happiness. Abigail threw herself into making the cabin into a true home, adding curtains to the windows and growing herbs in a small garden near the porch. She learned to shoot so she could defend herself and help provide for their table. She learned to tan hides and smoke meat and preserve vegetables for the long winter. She learned the rhythms of mountain life, the signs that told you when weather was coming, the tracks that revealed which animals had passed through in the night. Caden taught her everything he knew, patient and thorough, never making her feel foolish when she struggled to master a new skill. He built her a chicken coop and brought home 6 laying hens from town, knowing she wanted fresh eggs. He expanded the garden space, breaking new ground with his own hands so she could plant more of the vegetables and flowers she loved. He crafted furniture for the cabin, a proper dresser for her clothes, a desk where she could write letters, a bookshelf to hold the volumes they were slowly collecting. They grew together like trees that had been planted side by side, their roots intertwining beneath the surface, their branches reaching upward in tandem. They learned to read each other's moods, to anticipate needs before they were spoken, to communicate with looks and touches as much as with words. They had disagreements, of course, moments of frustration or miscommunication, but they worked through them with honesty and respect, never letting anger fester or resentment build. Rebecca Anderson became a true friend, riding over once a week to visit with Abigail, bringing news from the other homesteads and sometimes flour or sugar or other supplies that were hard to come by in the mountains. Thomas and Caden hunted together, watching each other's backs in the wilderness, and helped with the larger tasks that were easier with 2 men. The Anderson boys adopted Abigail as a surrogate aunt, showing up at odd hours with small treasures they had found, a pretty rock or an interesting bird's feather, seeking her approval and her stories. Winter came early that year, sweeping down from the north with howling winds and snow that piled in drifts taller than a man. Caden and Abigail spent those long, dark months huddled close by the fire, reading aloud to each other, playing cards, making love in the warm nest of their bed while the world outside froze solid. They talked for hours, sharing dreams and fears and memories, weaving their separate pasts into a shared history. It was during one of those winter nights with snow scratching against the windows and the fire crackling merrily in the hearth that Abigail realized she was pregnant. She had suspected for a few weeks, her monthly courses missing, her breasts tender, and odd queasiness in the mornings. but it was when she felt the first flutter of movement, like a butterfly trapped beneath her skin, that she knew for certain. "Caden," she said softly, interrupting his reading, "I need to tell you something." He looked up from his book, his eyes immediately concerned. "What's wrong? Are you feeling ill?" "I'm pregnant," Abigail said, the words tumbling out in a rush. "We're going to have a baby." For a moment, Caden just stared at her, his expression frozen in shock. Then his face broke into the most beautiful smile Abigail had ever seen, joy radiating from him like heat from the sun. He dropped his book and crossed to her in 2 strides, dropping to his knees beside her chair and pressing his hands to her still flat belly. "A baby," he breathed, wonder thick in his voice. "We're going to have a baby." "Are you happy?" Abigail asked, though she could already see the answer written clearly on his face. "Happy doesn't even begin to cover it," Caden said, looking up at her with eyes that were suspiciously bright. "You've given me everything, Abigail. A home, a purpose, love, and now a family. I don't have words for what that means to me." He kissed her then, tender and reverent, his hand never leaving her belly as though he could already feel the life growing there. "I'm going to be a father," he murmured against her lips. "God help that child, because I have no idea what I'm doing." "You'll be wonderful," Abigail assured him, running her fingers through his hair. "You're patient and kind and strong. You'll teach our child to love the land and respect the creatures that live here. You'll teach them to read and to think and to stand up for what's right. What more could any child need?" "A mother like you," Caden said simply. "That's what they'll need most." The rest of the winter passed in a haze of preparation and anticipation. Caden began crafting a cradle from smooth pine, carving intricate designs of mountains and trees and animals into the wood. Abigail sewed tiny clothes and blankets, her hands moving with careful stitches while her mind wandered to the future, imagining what their child might look like, whether they would have Caden's gray eyes or her own brown ones, whether they would be tall and strong like their father or smaller and quick like their mother. Rebecca was overjoyed at the news, immediately taking Abigail under her wing with advice and reassurance and practical help. She had birthed 3 children of her own and knew exactly what to expect and how to handle it. She promised to be there when Abigail's time came to help with the delivery and the first difficult weeks of caring for a newborn. Spring arrived in a rush of melting snow and budding trees, and with it came renewed energy. Caden prepared the garden for planting, while Abigail directed from a chair he had placed in the sunshine, her belly now swollen with the obvious evidence of the life she carried. They talked about names, debating options, and laughing at the more ridiculous suggestions. They talked about the future, about expanding the cabin to add a proper nursery, about what it would mean to raise a child in these remote hills. "Do you ever regret it?" Caden asked one evening as they sat on the porch watching the sunset. "Staying here instead of going to town where there are more people, more opportunities?" "Never," Abigail said firmly, reaching for his hand. "This is where I'm meant to be, with you in this place we've built together. Our child will grow up knowing how to be self-sufficient and strong. They'll grow up with space to run and explore, with clean air and clear skies. They'll grow up loved and wanted. What more could I possibly want?" The baby came in late August, on a hot, humid day when the air hung thick and heavy. Abigail's labor started just before dawn, waking her with a pain that wrapped around her belly and back like an iron band. Caden woke instantly at her gasp, his hand immediately going to her face. "It's time," she managed through gritted teeth. "Send for Rebecca." Caden moved with controlled urgency, dressing quickly and saddling his horse in record time. He rode hard for the Anderson homestead, returning less than an hour later with Rebecca and enough supplies to stock a small hospital. Thomas came too, to keep Caden company and sane, while the women handled the business of bringing new life into the world. The labor was long and difficult. Abigail had always been strong, but this tested her in ways she had never imagined. The pain was overwhelming, coming in waves that left her gasping and shaking. But Rebecca was there with cool cloths and encouraging words, and even though Caden wasn't allowed in the bedroom during the actual birth, she could hear his voice through the door, a low rumble of concern and support that gave her strength when she thought she had none left. Finally, as the sun was setting and painting the sky in shades of crimson and gold, Abigail gave one last desperate push and felt the baby slip free. For a moment there was silence, terrifying and complete, and then the thin wail of a newborn filled the cabin, the most beautiful sound Abigail had ever heard. "It's a boy," Rebecca announced, her face split with a wide smile as she cleaned the baby and wrapped him in a soft blanket. A big, healthy boy. 10 fingers, 10 toes, lungs that work just fine, and a head full of dark hair. She placed the bundle in Abigail's arms, and Abigail looked down at her son for the first time. He was perfect, absolutely perfect, with a red scrunched face and tiny fists that waved in the air as he cried. She could already see Caden in him, in the shape of his nose and the set of his jaw. Tears streamed down her face as she held him close, overwhelmed with love so fierce it was almost painful. "Can Caden come in now?" she asked Rebecca, unable to tear her eyes away from her son. "Of course." Rebecca opened the door and called out, "You can meet your son now." Caden practically ran into the room, his face white with worry that transformed to wonder as he saw Abigail sitting up in bed, tired but glowing, holding their child. He approached slowly, almost reverently, as though afraid he might break the spell. "A boy," Abigail said softly, holding up the baby for him to see. "We have a son." Caden sat carefully on the edge of the bed and reached out with shaking hands to touch the baby's head, his fingers looking impossibly large against the delicate skull. "He's so small," he breathed, "so perfect. Abigail, he's perfect. Do you want to hold him?" "I'm afraid I'll drop him." "You won't. Here." Abigail carefully transferred the baby to Caden's arms, showing him how to support the head, how to tuck the bundle against his chest. Caden held his son with the same careful reverence he had shown when he first touched Abigail's injured ankle, his entire being focused on the tiny life in his arms. "Hello, little one," he murmured, his voice thick with emotion. "I'm your father. I'm going to teach you everything I know. I'm going to keep you safe and warm and loved. I'm going to make sure you grow up strong and good, and I'm going to tell you every single day how lucky I am that you're here." Abigail watched her husband bond with their son and felt her heart expand until she thought it might burst. This was everything she had never known she wanted. This was family. This was home. This was love in its purest, most powerful form. They named him Connor, after Caden's father Thomas as his middle name to honor their friend. Connor Zane grew like a weed, healthy and happy and curious about everything. He had his father's gray eyes and his mother's quick smile, and from the moment he could crawl, he was into everything, exploring the cabin with fearless determination. Caden proved to be exactly the father Abigail had known he would be. He was patient with Connor's endless questions, careful with his small hands when he taught him to touch gentle creatures, proud when the boy showed interest in learning new skills. He carved toys for him, built him a small rocking horse, told him stories about the mountains and the animals that lived in them. He was protective without being smothering, allowing Connor the freedom to explore while always keeping a watchful eye. Abigail blossomed in motherhood, finding reserves of patience and creativity she hadn't known she possessed. She sang to Connor, taught him his letters as soon as he could focus, read him stories from the growing collection of children's books that Caden brought back from trips to town. She mended his scraped knees and soothed his nightmares and celebrated his small victories with genuine delight. 2 years after Connor was born, Abigail found herself pregnant again. This time the pregnancy was easier, her body knowing what to expect, and when her time came, the labor was shorter and less frightening. She gave birth to a daughter this time, a tiny thing with wisps of auburn hair and Abigail's own brown eyes. They named her Catherine, called her Kate, and Connor was instantly smitten with his baby sister, wanting to help with everything from changing her clothes to singing her lullabies. The cabin was expanded to accommodate their growing family, with Caden and Thomas working together to add 2 proper bedrooms and enlarge the main living space. The sounds of children's laughter filled the rooms where once there had been only silence. The walls were decorated now with drawings and handprints, with shelves holding carved toys and rag dolls, with all the beautiful chaos of a life fully lived. Years passed in this way, marked by seasons and harvests and the steady growth of their children. Connor grew tall and strong like his father, learning to hunt and trap, to read the land and respect its power. Kate proved to be clever and quick-witted, with a gift for growing things that had the garden flourishing under her care, even when she was barely old enough to hold a hoe. Abigail and Caden's love deepened with time, the initial passion settling into something richer and more complex. They knew each other completely now, every scar and secret and dream. They had weathered difficult times together, years when game was scarce and money was tight, winters that seemed to last forever, illnesses that struck without warning. But they had also celebrated countless joys, first steps and first words and first successful hunts, births and weddings and quiet evenings on the porch watching their children play. On a warm summer evening, 15 years after Caden had first carried Abigail across his threshold, they sat together on that same porch, while Connor and Kate chased fireflies in the gathering dusk. Connor was nearly 16 now, already taller than his father and showing signs of the man he would become. Kate was 13, poised on the edge of young womanhood, beautiful and bright and fiercely independent. "Do you remember that day in Salina?" Abigail asked, leaning against Caden's shoulder. "When you chose me?" "Every detail," Caden said, wrapping his arm around her waist. "You were sitting in that wagon, injured and defiant, refusing to show weakness even though I could see you were in agony. I looked at you and knew that if I let you go, I would regret it for the rest of my life." "I thought you were crazy," Abigail admitted with a laugh. "Who chooses the broken one when there are so many better options?" "You were never broken," Caden said firmly, turning to look at her with those gray eyes that still made her heart skip. "You were wounded, but there's a difference. Broken things can't be fixed. Wounded things heal, given time and care and love. I saw someone worth healing. I saw someone worth building a life with, and I was right. Look at what we've created, Abigail. Look at this family, this home, this life. It's everything I never knew I needed." "I love you," Abigail said softly, reaching up to touch his bearded face. "I have loved you since those first weeks when you were so patient with me, so kind when you had no reason to be. I will love you until the day I die, and beyond that if such things are possible." "I love you too," Caden replied, kissing her gently. "My limping bride who turned out to be the strongest person I've ever known. Thank you for saying yes. Thank you for staying. Thank you for everything." They sat together in the fading light, watching their children play, listening to the evening sounds of the mountains they had made their home. Life had not always been easy, but it had been good. It had been real. It had been filled with the kind of love that sustained and strengthened, that built rather than destroyed, that gave meaning to every difficult day and joy to every celebration. Connor would eventually build his own cabin on a piece of land adjacent to theirs, bringing home a wife from town and starting his own family. Kate would marry a young man from a homestead further south, moving away but visiting regularly, filling the cabin with grandchildren who would listen wide-eyed to stories about the grandmother who had arrived injured and afraid and built a life of courage and love. Caden and Abigail would grow old together in the cabin he had carried her into on that long-ago day. They would sit on their porch and watch the seasons change, holding hands and telling stories, still deeply in love after decades of marriage. They would weather the changing times, the coming of railroads and telegraph lines, the slow transformation of the wild frontier into something more civilized and settled. But the mountains would remain, and so would their love, constant and enduring as the stone peaks that surrounded their home. And when visitors asked about their story, about how they had found each other in this vast and often harsh land, Caden would always smile and say the same thing. "I chose her because I saw her strength. I kept her because I fell in love with her heart. I married her because I couldn't imagine my life without her. And every single day since, I've been grateful for the choice I made to take the limping one." And Abigail would add, her eyes bright with love and memory, "And every single day since, I've been grateful that he saw past my injury to the person beneath. He gave me a home when I had none, safety when I was in danger, and love when I had given up hoping for it. He gave me everything." Their children would roll their eyes at hearing the story for the 1,000th time, but secretly they cherished it, this tale of how their parents had found each other against all odds. It was a story about seeing value where others saw only damage, about choosing strength over perfection, about building something lasting from the most unlikely beginnings. It was a story about love, real and true and tested by time. And it was a story that would be passed down through generations, a reminder that the best things in life often come from the most unexpected places, and that sometimes the greatest gift you can give someone is the simple act of choosing them, exactly as they are, and believing in who they can become. Years later, when Caden and Abigail were both old and gray, sitting on their porch wrapped in quilts against the evening chill, they would still hold hands and watch the sunset together. Their children and grandchildren would visit regularly, filling the expanded cabin with noise and laughter and the beautiful chaos of a large, loving family. Connor had indeed built his cabin nearby, raising 3 sons who all shared the Zane passion for the mountains. He had his father's size and strength, but his mother's quick mind, and he ran a successful outfitting business, guiding hunters and trappers into the high country. His wife, Sarah, was a quiet woman with gentle hands and a gift for healing, and she had become like another daughter to Abigail. Kate had married her young man, Daniel, and moved to his family's homestead about 20 miles south. They raised wheat and cattle, building a prosperous operation through hard work and smart management. Kate came home at least once a month, bringing her 4 children, 2 boys and 2 girls, all of them inheriting her cleverness and her love of growing things. She and Abigail would spend hours in the garden, talking about everything and nothing, maintaining the close bond they had always shared. The original cabin had been expanded multiple times over the years, growing organically as the family's needs changed. There were proper bedrooms now for visiting family, a larger kitchen to handle the crowds that gathered for holidays, a workroom where Abigail still sewed and Caden still carved. But the heart of the home remained that original single room with its massive stone fireplace, where they had spent those first months learning each other, falling in love, building the foundation of everything that came after. Caden was 72 now, his hair completely white but still thick and long, his beard more silver than dark. Age had stolen some of his strength, but none of his presence. He still stood tall and straight, still moved with purpose and confidence, still had those remarkable gray eyes that could see straight through pretense. His hands, scarred and weathered by decades of hard work, were still gentle when they touched his wife, still careful when they held a grandchild. Abigail was 69, her auburn hair faded to a soft gray-brown, her face lined with the evidence of a life well lived. Her ankle, that injury that had brought her to this place, sometimes ached when the weather changed, a reminder of how their story had begun. But she had never truly limped again after those first months, had proven herself capable of anything she set her mind to. She had been a pioneer wife, a mother, a grandmother, a teacher to her children and neighbor children who wanted to learn their letters. She had been everything she needed to be, and she had done it all with grace and strength. On this particular evening, as the sun set over the familiar valley and painted the sky in shades of purple and gold, they sat together as they had done thousands of times before. Connor was inside preparing dinner, his deep voice mingling with Sarah's lighter tones as they worked together in the kitchen. The grandchildren were scattered around the property, the older ones helping with evening chores, the younger ones playing games in the last of the daylight. "Do you think we did well?" Abigail asked softly, a question she had never asked before because she had never needed to. But now, looking back over their long life together, she wanted to hear him say it. Caden was quiet for a moment, his thumb rubbing gentle circles on the back of her hand. "I think we did better than well," he said finally. "I think we built something real and good and lasting. Look at our children, Abigail. Look at how they've turned out. They're strong and honest and kind. They know how to work hard and how to love deeply. They understand the value of family and the importance of keeping your word. That's our legacy, all of that. Not this cabin or this land, but the people we raised and the values we passed on. I'm proud of them," Abigail said, her voice thick with emotion. "I'm proud of us." "As you should be. You took a chance on a mountain man who didn't know the first thing about courting a woman properly. You agreed to marry a stranger and build a life in the middle of nowhere. You birthed our children and raised them right. You turned a bachelor's rough cabin into a home filled with love and laughter. You did all of that, Abigail, and you did it with courage and determination and more grace than I could have hoped for." "We did it together," Abigail corrected gently. "Every step of the way, we did it together. That was the secret, I think. Neither of us trying to control or dominate, both of us working as partners toward the same goal. You respected me, Caden. You valued my opinions and my contributions. You never made me feel less than, never treated me as property even though that's what the law said I was. You gave me agency and voice and space to grow. That's what made the difference. You made it easy, Caden said, lifting her hand to his lips and kissing her knuckles with the same reverence he had shown on their wedding day. You were always my equal, Abigail, my partner in the truest sense. I never wanted a servant or someone to order around. I wanted someone to share this life with, someone who would challenge me and inspire me and make me better. I got all of that and more when I chose you that day in Salina. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the stars begin to appear in the darkening sky. The sounds of family drifted out from the cabin, the clink of dishes being set on the table, the laughter of children, the low murmur of adult conversation. This was peace, Abigail thought. This was what contentment felt like, this deep satisfaction with a life fully lived, with choices well made, with love given and received in equal measure. "I'd do it all again," she said suddenly, the words surprising her even as she spoke them. Every difficult moment, every hard winter, every time I was scared or worried or exhausted, I'd do all of it again exactly the same way because it led me here, to this moment, to this life with you. Me too, Caden agreed, his arm coming around her shoulders to pull her close against his side. Though I might choose to meet you under different circumstances, I'd have preferred to court you properly, take you to dances and bring you flowers and win your heart the traditional way. Abigail laughed softly. I don't know that the traditional way would have worked for us. I think we needed the intensity of our beginning, the way we were thrown together and forced to figure it out. It stripped away all the pretense and politeness that usually gets in the way of really knowing someone. We learned each other at the deepest level right from the start. There was no hiding, no performing, no, just two people being honest about who they were and what they needed. You're probably right, Caden conceded. As usual. I'm always right, Abigail teased, her tone light. You should know that by now, after all these years. Oh, I do know it. I learned that lesson very early on. He kissed the top of her head, breathing in the familiar scent of her hair. I love you, Abigail Zane. I have loved you every single day since I first saw you in that wagon, and I will love you for whatever time we have left and beyond. I love you too, Abigail replied, settling more comfortably against him. My mountain man, my protector, my partner, my love. Connor appeared in the doorway, backlit by the warm glow of lamplight from inside. Dinner's ready, he announced, his voice carrying the same deep timbre as his father's. Come on in before it gets cold. Caden rose first, his movements slower than they once were, but still steady, and held out his hand to help Abigail to her feet. She took it, allowing him to pull her up, her old ankle protesting only slightly. They walked into the cabin together, hand in hand as they had been for over 4 decades, entering the warm embrace of family and home. The table was crowded with people, 3 generations gathered to share a meal in each other's company. Connor had made his father's venison stew, the recipe passed down and perfected over the years, and the smell filled the cabin with memories. Sarah had baked fresh bread, golden and crusty, and one of the grandchildren had picked early apples for a pie that was cooling on the windowsill. They took their places at the table, Caden and Abigail in the chairs they always occupied, with family ranged around them. Before they ate, Caden led them in a simple grace, thanking God for the food and the family and the life they had been blessed to live. And then they ate together, talking and laughing, sharing stories and making plans, living fully in the moment while honoring the past that had brought them there. Later that night, after the dishes were washed and the grandchildren were settled in their beds, and the cabin was quiet except for the crackle of the fire, Caden and Abigail made their way to their bedroom. It was the same room where they had first come together as husband and wife, though the furniture had been replaced multiple times over the years. The bed was the same, though, the massive frame that Caden had built by hand, sturdy enough to last generations. They prepared for bed with the easy intimacy of long marriage, helping each other with buttons and ties that arthritic fingers sometimes struggled with. Caden braided Abigail's hair loosely to keep it from tangling in the night. Abigail made sure Caden took the tonic the doctor had prescribed for his aching joints. They moved around each other with practiced efficiency, knowing without words what needed to be done. When they finally climbed into bed and Caden pulled Abigail into his arms, she sighed with contentment. This was home, this embrace, this feeling of safety and love and belonging. Age had changed many things, but not this fundamental connection between them, this bone-deep certainty that they were exactly where they were meant to be. "Thank you," Abigail whispered into the darkness, her head resting over Caden's heart so she could hear its steady beat. "For what?" Caden asked, his hand stroking slow patterns on her back. "For choosing me. For seeing me when I was invisible to everyone else. For giving me this life, this family, this love. For every day of the past 43 years. For everything." "The thanks should be mine," Caden replied softly. "You were the gift, Abigail. You were the blessing I didn't know I was waiting for. The day I chose you was the day my real life began. Everything before that was just preparation, just waiting until I found the person who would make everything make sense." They lay together in the darkness, listening to the night sounds outside their window, the whisper of wind through the pines, the distant call of an owl, the creak and settle of the cabin around them. This place had sheltered them through everything, had been witness to their joys and sorrows, had held their love and protected their family. It was more than just logs and stone. It was the physical manifestation of everything they had built together. "Do you think they'll remember?" Abigail asked, drowsiness beginning to creep into her voice. "Our grandchildren and their children after them, do you think they'll remember our story?" "They'll remember," Caden assured her, his own voice growing heavy with sleep. "Because it's a story worth remembering. It's a story about choosing love over convenience, about seeing value where others see only damage, about building something lasting from the unlikeliest beginning. That's the kind of story that gets passed down, that becomes part of a family's identity. They'll tell their children about the mountain man who chose the limping bride, and how that choice changed everything." "Good," Abigail murmured, her eyes drifting closed. "I want them to know that love is a choice, not just a feeling. That real love is built through action and commitment and showing up every single day, even when it's hard, especially when it's hard." "That's exactly what they'll learn," Caden promised, holding her closer. "Now sleep, my love. Rest." And Abigail slept, safe in the arms of the man who had chosen her, protected by the love they had built together, surrounded by the family they had created and the home they had made. She slept peacefully, without fear or regret, deeply satisfied with the life she had lived. The years continued to pass, gentle and slow. Caden and Abigail's health remained relatively good, though they moved more carefully and tired more easily. They still took walks together around the property when the weather was fair, still sat on their porch every evening to watch the sunset, still held hands and shared quiet conversation in the moments between sleep and waking. Their family continued to grow. Connor's sons married and began families of their own. Kate's children grew into capable young adults, taking over more and more of the homestead's operation. Great-grandchildren arrived, tiny miracles that Abigail held with trembling hands, and Caden watched with eyes that misted over with emotion they didn't try to hide. The mountains around them changed too, as civilization crept steadily westward. There were more homesteads now, more trails. Even talk of a proper road being built that would make travel to Salina easier. But their cabin remained a constant, an anchor point in a shifting world, the place where family gathered for holidays and celebrations, where stories were told and traditions were maintained. On a crisp autumn afternoon in their 76th year together, Caden and Abigail sat on their porch wrapped in quilts, watching the leaves turn gold and red on the trees that surrounded their home. The air smelled of wood smoke and approaching winter, familiar and comforting. Their hands were clasped together as they had been countless times before, fingers intertwined despite the stiffness of age. "It's beautiful," Abigail said softly, her voice still clear despite her years. "I never get tired of this view." "Neither do I," Caden agreed, "though I have to admit the view I appreciate most is the one sitting right beside me." Abigail smiled, the expression lighting up her lined face. "You old charmer, still trying to win my heart after all these years?" "I won your heart decades ago," Caden replied with satisfaction. "Now I'm just maintaining my advantage." They laughed together, the sound warm and genuine, And in that moment they were not old people nearing the end of their lives, but young lovers, still delighted by each other's company, still finding joy in shared jokes and gentle teasing. Connor came out to check on them, his own hair now streaked with gray, his face showing the marks of a life spent outdoors. "You two need anything?" he asked, his concern evident in every line of his body. "We're fine, son," Caden assured him, "just enjoying the day." "Sarah's making your favorite for dinner," Connor told his mother. "Roast chicken with those herb dumplings you taught her." "Wonderful," Abigail said, her eyes bright with pleasure. "Tell her thank you for me." Connor nodded and returned inside, but not before Abigail saw him pause in the doorway to look back at them, his expression tender and slightly sad. He knew, she realized, he could see what she herself felt, that their time was growing short, that the seasons were winding down. But there was no fear in that knowledge, only acceptance and gratitude for the life they had been given. That night, Caden and Abigail lay in their bed, comfortable and warm despite the chill in the air. They had said their good nights to Connor and Sarah, had held each grandchild who was there, and blessed them with gentle words and loving touches. Now it was just the two of them, as it had been in the beginning and as it would be in the end. "I'm tired," Abigail admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "Not sad, not scared, just tired." "I know," Caden said, drawing her closer. "Me too. I don't want to leave you," she continued, tears slipping down her cheeks. "I don't want you to be alone." "I won't be alone long," Caden promised, his own voice rough with emotion, "but I'm not ready to let you go yet either. So let's not talk about endings. Let's talk about everything we've had. Let's remember all the good parts." And so they did, whispering in the darkness, sharing memories that spanned more than 7 decades. They remembered that first day in Salina, the terror and hope mingled together, the moment Caden had said those fateful words that changed everything. They remembered the wedding, simple and beautiful, and their first night as husband and wife. They remembered Connor's birth, the moment they became parents, and Kate's arrival 2 years later. They remembered holidays and birthdays, hard winters and glorious summers, moments of struggle and triumph and everyday joy. They talked until their voices grew hoarse and their eyelids grew heavy. And then, still holding each other, they drifted into sleep, their breathing synchronized, their hearts beating in tandem as they had for more than 70 years. Abigail passed peacefully in her sleep 3 weeks later, slipping away during the night with Caden's arms around her and his whispered words of love the last thing she heard. The grief that swept through the family was profound, but tempered by the knowledge that she had lived a full and joyous life, that she had been deeply loved and had loved deeply in return, that she had left behind a legacy that would endure for generations. True to his word, Caden did not linger long without her. He made it through the winter, keeping his promise to watch over the family, to see Kate through a difficult pregnancy that resulted in a healthy great-granddaughter, to help Connor with spring preparations. But on a warm day in early May, sitting in his rocking chair on the porch with the sun on his face and the mountains spread before him, he closed his eyes and followed Abigail wherever she had gone. They were buried side by side on a small rise behind the cabin, their graves marked with simple stones that bore their names and the dates that bookended their extraordinary lives. The family gathered to mourn and celebrate, to share stories and tears, to honor the couple who had built this legacy from nothing but determination and love. Connor, speaking at the graveside service, summed up their lives with words that resonated with everyone present. "My father once told me that the day he chose my mother was the day his real life began. Everything before that was just waiting. They built this family and this home through hard work and deep love, through choosing each other every single day even when it was difficult, through believing in the power of partnership and commitment. They taught us what it means to love truly and completely. They showed us that strength comes in many forms, and they left us with an example that we will carry forward for all the days of our lives." The cabin remained in the family, passed down through the generations just as Caden and Abigail had hoped it would be. Each new generation added their own touches while respecting the bones of the original structure, maintaining it as a gathering place and a reminder of where they came from. The story of how it all began, of the mountain man who chose the limping woman and carried her gently across his threshold, was told and retold until it became part of the family's mythology, a foundation story that explained who they were and what they valued. And on quiet evenings when the family gathered on that porch to watch the sunset, older members would sometimes swear they could feel the presence of Caden and Abigail still lingering there, could almost hear their quiet conversation and gentle laughter, could sense the love that had built this place and held it together through everything. It was a love that transcended death, that lived on in the stones of the cabin and the hearts of the descendants, that proved itself stronger than time or circumstance or any obstacle the world could throw at it. It was a love worth remembering, a love worth celebrating, a love that would echo through the generations, reminding everyone who heard the story that sometimes the greatest adventures begin with the simplest choice, that damaged does not mean broken, and that real love sees past surface imperfections to the strength and beauty beneath. It was the story of Caden and Abigail Zane, the mountain man, and his limping bride, who built a legacy of love that would last forever.